Over the years, I've worked with lots of teams and have met lots of different leaders. Some have been very, very effective, some not so much. And I've often wondered, what really makes a leader so effective? Why are some very popular? Why are they liked? Why do they get a lot done? How do they manage to motivate their team? Whereas others are treated with not so much respect. They're even disliked. People go a long way to avoid them. I think it all boils down to style. It boils down to the style that these leaders show up with. So what do we mean when we talk about leadership style? How do you develop yours? And how can you use it to maximum effect? Let me define what I think leadership style is and what it isn't. It's not the same as personality. Personality is something we're born with. For example, we may be outgoing, we may be more introverted. These are pretty fixed traits and don't change much over a lifetime. Leadership style, however, is full of qualities that we can and should work on, challenge ourselves, evolve, and adapt over time. In other words, they're very flexible, and they're skills, a whole set of skills that we can learn. Generally speaking, they fall under two dimensions. And a lot of social psychologists talk about the dimension of power and the dimension of attractiveness. Along the dimension of power in leadership, we can show up as being very dominant or bossy, and yet at the other end of that same spectrum, we can show up as being decisive. We can also show up as being assertive. Along the attractiveness dimension, we can show up as being very warm, approachable, and open. But we can also show up as being too apologetic or perhaps too willing to give in to the ideas and decisions and words of others and not standing up for ourselves. So there's nothing inherently good or bad about the power dimension or the attractiveness dimension. It's more, where are we choosing to place ourselves along those dimensions at any given moment? This is what's going to define our leadership style. So what's your default leadership style? Well, you might not yet have had a lot of experience, explicitly anyway, in being a leader. You might not yet have a full sense of exactly how you show up. But as time passes and you get more experience, listen to the kind of comments or feedback coming from those around you, especially in situations like a performance evaluation. Do people talk about you being decisive? Do they talk about you being indecisive? Do they talk about you going it alone? Or do they talk about you listening to everyone, perhaps at the expense of making any decisions? These are the kinds of things that are useful to know where you're at in terms of your default leadership style. And the important thing, and I've seen this with the most successful leaders, is having the courage and the curiosity to try out different styles. What will it be like if I do this a little bit differently? You know, I remember last week's meeting and so-and-so carried on a little bit too long and I didn't interject, I didn't redirect the focus of the conversation. How can I do that differently this week? That's the kind of thing that would show we are working on changing, exploring different leadership styles. Two very important ideas to consider when we're exploring our leadership style is how we feel and how we act. There are different schools of thought about this, and we don't have time to go into the full debate right now. Suffice it to say that if we feel confident, it will impact on how we show up. In other words, we need to make a conscious decision before a tough presentation or a difficult meeting that we're going to go in with a sense of feeling confident. But by the same token, the way we actually behave, including things like our body language and the choice of words we use, these can impact the impressions that others have around us, and they can feed back on how we feel. So these two ideas are definitely interconnected. Both are important, and in our leadership style, how we feel and how we show up play off and feed off each other. To create maximum impact with your leadership style, it really is very, very important to know your strengths and to know your weaknesses. For example, I might know that I'm very good at diplomatically solving disputes between two members of my team. But I might also know that if somebody has an emotional episode and breaks down in a flood of tears, I want to run a mile because I don't know how to cope with that. So I have a strength as a leader, but there's also an area of deficit that I need to work on. Knowing and identifying these kinds of things are critical in developing a successful and really effective leadership style. So ask yourself constantly, and the asking never ends, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? It's very important to be flexible as you develop your leadership style. There is a very famous series of management books, The 1 Minute Manager, that started life 40 or 50 years ago now. And the whole premise of the 1 Minute Manager is that we can and should identify what's needed right now in the style we show up with. Does this person on our team need us to be decisive and tell them what to do? Or are they reasonably high in their competence level and just need a small suggestion or a nudge? Or maybe the real gift is in the questions you can ask rather than the directions you give. So being flexible, being able to shift style depending on the situation and the person you're dealing with is really, really important. Linked to this is the idea of evolving. We need to evolve over time. Just because you've always had a particular style over the last 6 months with a new member of your team, that doesn't mean it's a good reason to keep it forever. As that person develops experience, confidence, and competence, your style of leadership in relation to them might and arguably should need to change. In other words, as they grow more confident, you can take a more hands-off approach. You perhaps don't need to be as directive. You might even want to leave them to it most of the time and just ask them to let you know if they have questions. So you need to evolve, and you recognize that individuals and teams as a whole change over time. Keeping the same style every day with every person you interact with is not the idea of a dynamic and effective leadership style. Really importantly is the idea of never ever trying to imitate leaders that we respect. Of course, we can draw inspiration and we can look at certain behaviors and think, yes, that's something I'd like to incorporate in my leadership style. But trying to become one specific leader that you might have liked or been influenced by, maybe even going back to a teacher at high school that you remember as being very effective, is never going to be totally successful. The important thing is you develop your own style. Be inspired by others, but don't try and imitate them. It never works. It's important also to have a vision of the kind of leader you want to be. Now, this doesn't have to be set in stone. In fact, perhaps the healthiest vision is to be a dynamic leader, one that's always seeking to change and evolve. What kind of leader do you want to be? What kind of team do you want to lead? If you have a vision at the back of your mind, then it can really help you in maximizing and exploring the kind of leadership style that you want to adopt. Perhaps one of the greatest and yet underrated skills of developing and maximizing your leadership style is that of learning how to delegate and also learning how to coach. Now, I could talk for a long time on both of those topics, and that's beyond the scope of this presentation right now. But suffice it to say that if we are learning to delegate, we're learning when to take a step back and to place responsibility and trust in those who are working in our team. That's one of the most important leadership skills that a lot of new leaders often don't embrace. In our fix-it world where we want to try and be superhumans, we often take on too much and try to do too many things ourselves. So it's important to learn when, as part of being an effective leader, your style will allow you to step back and allow others to take responsibility and flourish often in the process. One of the ways we can help do this is the other word I mentioned, coaching. Coaching is when we stop being a directive, instruction-based leader. Sure, there's a time and a place to tell people what to do and give them specific instructions, but coaching is about inviting them to brainstorm their own solutions, answer their own questions, and gently steer them in a direction that will allow them to flourish as a member of your team. In other words, you don't always have to be reading out specific lists of requests or instructions and needing people to do things exactly as you say. Generally, those kinds of leaders are neither the most popular nor the most effective. And finally, perhaps most important of all, is that in whichever direction your leadership style evolves, whatever impact you have on others, and however you choose to explore the different ways that your style can show up in a team, you have to be authentic. If you're faking it, you won't feel comfortable, and the others around you will know you're not being authentic. The most effective leaders are the ones who are able to make mistakes and admit them, to ask for help, to apologize when they screw things up. All of that is about authenticity. And the single most idea in developing your leadership style is that if you're not authentic, you're really not a leader at all. I wish you well on your journey as you explore your unique style of being an amazing leader.